Hello and welcome everyone in the room and online. We are streaming this as a webinar today and also hosting a few people with us, including our panelists. As usual, I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at the Arab Gulf States Institute. And we're happy to have you all with us as we take a closer look at the negotiations taking place between the Trump administration and the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran. We are in our new offices that we haven't officially inaugurated yet, but we're welcome our in-person guests. And I'm sure the folks on Zoom are seeing this for the first time as well. So to help us take a closer look at this topic today, we have a wonderful panel of experts, and we'll start with Sara Bazoobandi, who happens to be in Washington visiting from Germany, and gave us kind of the idea to put this together. It was perfect timing as well. So thank you, Sara. Sara is a non-resident fellow with us here at AGSIW, and she's also an associate at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, where she was previously a Marie Curie research fellow. She's also a non-resident research fellow at the Institute for Security Politics at Kiel University in Germany. And also with us is our friend Behnam Taleblu. Welcome, Behnam. He's a senior director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies Iran program, where he oversees the breadth and depth of FDD's work on Iran, in addition to serving as a senior fellow specializing in Iranian security and political issues. For well over a decade, he has supported FDD's Iran program as a senior fellow, research fellow, and senior Iran analyst. Last but not least is my colleague Ali Alfoneh. He's a senior fellow here at AGSIW. He's a political scientist by training and the originator of the theory of the transformation of the Islamic Republic into a military dictatorship. He's also the author of Political Succession in the Islamic Republic of Iran, A Demise of the Clergy and the Rise of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. And moderating the session today is our Executive Vice President, Ambassador William Roebuck. Before his time here, he had a long and illustrious career at the State Department, and his postings included U.S. Ambassador to Bahrain. And with that, we'll turn it over to the panel. But just a quick reminder that this session is on the record, it's being recorded, and the video stream that's on Zoom will also be made available to everybody in the next couple of days. And with that, Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Raymond, and welcome everyone to today's panel, both our live audience as well as those attending by Zoom technology. I think Raymond gave a brief introduction, but it's obvious that the recently concluded third round of talks in Muscat between the Iranian side and the American side are making clear, and a stream of interviews from President Trump and senior Iranian officials are reinforcing that perspective that this is the subject of the day in terms of regional and international focus. So this is a well-timed seminar that we're doing here. The overall tone for the meetings that have been held so far from officials is optimistic, I would say, although cautious, heavily cautioned optimism. And there are expectations for further meetings in the coming week or two. Now, Iran's nuclear program is not a new controversy. It's not a new topic. It has engaged policymakers and public attention for more than 2 decades. But the issue has generated even more headlines as President Trump, who famously pulled out of the previous nuclear accords, has this time around expressed significant optimism about these talks and the prospects for a new deal with Iran on their nuclear program. While at the same time, of course, he has warned of the possibility of devastating military attacks if these negotiations fail. Iran is also facing an October deadline for even harsher possible sanctions if it fails to reach an agreement under the terms of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is expiring at that time. Now, Iran has been severely weakened, as we know, in the past year from punishing Israeli attacks and after years of economic sanctions that have continued to take a toll on Iran. But Iran retains some leverage on this nuclear issue. According to analysts, they have about a 60% enrichment capability of uranium, and with increasing rates of speed. They've added additional cascades of advanced centrifuges and the capability of a severely compressed timeline for nuclear breakout. So there's a lot to discuss with our distinguished panel, and I want to get started with that right now. For audience members who have questions, among our live audience, if you have a question, you can signal to me, and I will let you answer that at the proper time. For members of our Zoom audience, if you would use the Q&A function to transmit your question, I will relay that to panel members when we open it up for questions. So with that, let's get started. I thought maybe to kick it off, we'll do a quick hit just assessment of where things are. I'll give each of you a couple of minutes to just give your assessment. I'll frame it for each of you. Ali, I'll give you the home field advantage. Your quick sense, where are we in the negotiations? Is this still the beginning? Is there really a 2-month deadline? Are we in the middle of the beginning? How would you characterize the progress so far?
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you for the invitation, for providing me with this opportunity to share my analysis with you. Let me start my answer with something somewhat unusual here in Washington by praising our political leaders, both of whom are showing great political courage in engaging almost heroic diplomacy. President Trump was extremely critical of a talk and a solution that he is trying to reach now. This is a sign of political courage, that he is agreeing to a deal, the contours of which resemble that of the JCPOA, of which he himself was critical. I believe this is a sign of political courage. Why? Because he believes that the alternative being war, is worse than a deal, even if that deal is flawed. Same thing applies to Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He has said many times that he distrusts the United States of America, that he personally distrusts President Trump. Nevertheless, he is showing political courage by engaging negotiations which resemble a process that he tried before and lost face when President Trump withdrew from the deal. But he's showing political courage. This is what he's doing. Arab leaders from the Persian Gulf region. I praise the courage of every single one of them. Look at the positive and constructive role they are playing in the negotiations today. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia sent his brother to Tehran to talk with Ayatollah Ali. United Arab Emirates was the emissary of President Trump, sending President Trump's letter to Ayatollah Ali. I praise it. Oman is hosting the talks, and the other countries too appear to be online. The same countries who were very critical of the JCPOA. Now we are seeing a very different approach. Why? Because they have political courage, and because they believe that the alternative is worse, even worse than a deal that they may not be 100% agreeing with. So I'm optimistic.
Thank you, Ali. Then I'm sort of the same question, but also as you weave in your sense of the progress, give us a quick sense of how we got here.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, Mabruk on the new offices. It's great to be here in person with you all and to share the panel with friends new and old. Listen, how we got here is a very long story and a very bumpy road. And like everything else in Washington, the answer of where you stand depends very much on where you sit. Is this a result of the successes of Israel's 2024 military campaigns that put Iran in a box? Is it a result of Iranian heroic flexibility 2.0 by the supreme leader choosing to engage? That is both a political answer and a policy answer. But I think pushing away from the table, I think you had the Iranians understand that they had one option that they had not explored under Trump 1.0, that they believe, given the return of the maximum pressure sanctions under Trump 2.0, that they need to try. And I actually remember this kind of being floated by then Foreign Minister Zarif, I think in 2019 in the spring during one of his resignation stunts, where amid that larger conversation, he talked about one reason, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, but one reason why Iran was unable to employ the North Korea diplomatic approach to President Trump. And he mentioned 4 Bs. You may remember those 4 Bs as Bolton, Bibi, bin Salman, bin Zayed. That was 2019, built on the grievances of 2015. But fast forward to 2025, those 4 Bs are not necessarily in the same place or not necessarily as ascendant in the same hawkish direction on Iran policy. One area, for example, where I disagree with my friend and colleague Ali, is it's not about, I think, courage or political maturity. It's actually about risk aversion and cost that has gotten our friends in the GCC back to this posture of hedging. I think they think, with respect, they have a crazy neighbor. They used to be able to call an external guarantor, like a policeman against the crazy neighbor. Now they decided that the policeman isn't delivering, and that is really a bipartisan, decade-plus foreign policy failure of the United States towards Saudi, towards the UAE, because of the Yemen war, because of many other things, foreign and domestic, oil, Khashoggi, you name it. Congress on the GCC, there's tons of issues that have been push and pull factors between the GCC and U.S. relationship that have moved, in my view, the GCC into the target position of the Islamic Republic. Some of you may remember, for example, Rouhani ad-libbed, then President Rouhani, also in 2019, ad-libbed an Arabic proverb into his otherwise all-Persian UNGA address about 2 weeks after the historic attacks that were on the Aramco facilities. That historic proverb, I'm going to butcher it in Arabic, so I'll just say the English translation is, first the neighbor, then the house. If you care about your house, accommodate your neighbor. So adar thumma ja, I think is the original Arabic. That was what he ad-libbed. And this is what he's seeing now, what the Iranians are seeing now from the GCC, kind of cozying up, taking care of things bilaterally, a la carte, not calling in the Americans to adjudicate things, is driven by Washington's inability or unwillingness to contain the Islamic Republic, and the recognition in places like Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and elsewhere that they are on their own, that they have domestic priorities, that they have economic priorities, and this has kind of opened up the space for much more diplomatic engagement. And this is one critical theory, or in my view, reason why we are where we are today. Another is, of course, the Islamic Republic's cognizance of its own external weakness and a willingness to play out this kind of tempt Trump dynamic. You see this very much in comments by the Iranian president, the foreign minister of Iran, Mr. Araghchi, talking about $1 trillion economic opportunity. One can only think about a Trump Tower Tehran thing that he may be aiming at with his Washington Post op-ed. And I actually think that they believe through style, they can achieve a newfound substance of their own. And perhaps the devil will hit the details as technical talks progress. Perhaps there will be something better, equal, or worse than the JCPOA. It's too soon to tell in my view yet, but the trend lines, I think, are more worrying if you are a proponent of maximum pressure and you were a major critic of the JCPOA. And the trend lines are more positive or optimistic if you think that the Iran problem, be it nuclear, regional, whatever, is a problem that one has to manage rather than a problem that one has to solve. And that, I think, is explaining this entirely newfound dynamic today.
Thank you, Behnam. Sara, same question, but also if you would focus a bit on if you have seen any surprises or anything unexpected in the talks so far.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure again to be back at the Institute. Again, congratulations for your new offices. I'm really looking forward to working with you under the new setting and with all the amazing changes that have been made. I would add to, it's very difficult, to be honest, that you put me in a very tough position after these two gentlemen to say anything, because I believe that everything else was said. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another layer into the analysis, and that is perhaps we could look at it through a different lens, and that is the lens of expediency. All the players see expediency is changing course of action. And of course, there is a huge and tremendous and very visible shift in narrative, in strategy, in model of engagement. For example, one of the major criticism of President Trump was that JCPOA was a bad deal. Now, the very people who were involved in drafting JCPOA and getting it signed are criticizing him for wanting to do another JCPOA. So it is a very interesting dynamics to see that what is going to come out of this eventually. But what we can see is that perhaps the stars are aligned. Tehran wants a deal because they are under tremendous amount of domestic and regional pressure. For reasons that was mentioned, I'm not going to repeat that. Regionally, since October the 7th, 2023, and of course domestically post-2022 uprising, and the very clear rift between the states and the citizens that has created this dynamic. I cannot think of anybody, any of my extended network of contacts and acquaintances inside Iran that I speak to that are saying that the situation is normal in Iran. Economically, socially, politically, everything is under pressure. And it's very difficult for the government to maintain this level of pressure. They are very good at managing crisis. And they have shown a great degree of resilience and resistance. And but it's very obvious that they're reaching a very critical point and something has to be done about it. What is also very interesting this time around is what I believe, with all due respect, I don't mean to sound patronizing at all, like I love you guys, Americans. But what the Iranians are doing is very successfully babysitting different American administrations. With Obama and the Democrats, they like to speak to somebody who has the same frame of thought. They like checks and balances, they liked orders. And what Iran managed to produce was to create an image that we have a mechanism for consensus building. That is Supreme National Security Council. In fact, according to the Constitution, Supreme National Security Council decisions are only approved if the supreme leader approves them. But they never said that last sentence. They said, no, we are normal, we have checks and balances, we think the same way as you do, we have the same frame of thought. We are a type of people that you could do business with. And Americans came out of that negotiations feeling, look, we have done an amazing job. We just gave them a few trillions of their own money, and we managed to put the nuclear program into a box. Hallelujah to that. Then fast forward in 2024, 2025, they started to adopt a new narrative. You cannot speak to any Iran analyst, pro or anti-regime, that doesn't tell you that the only decision maker in Tehran is Ayatollah Khamenei's office. Not him as a person, but he's got his internal, advisors and the inner circle and so on. So we moved on from that. We are one-to-one. It's President Trump and Supreme Leader. This is the model that the current US administration likes to deal with. We also have, the new dynamics of let's do business and so on and so forth. And I'm going to end this round of my comments with this, to leave you with this anecdote. Mr. Araqchi, only a few days ago, shared a public tweet calling Biden's administration the failed Biden administration, adopting a very favorable, very flattering narrative and language for President Trump's administration. And it shows that they are very good at managing expectations of the United States. So you could look at this through a very rose-tainted glass and say, well, they are desperate, they want to get a deal. You could also look at it in a very pessimistic way and say, well, perhaps they are up to something, but they just want to buy time. Snapbacks, for example, is the closest ticking clock. So we will delve into this a little bit deeper, but this is sort of my initial assessment.
Thank you, Sarah. So I want now to explore a little bit on the approach. Some of you have already said some things about the approach of each side. I want to expand a little bit on how each side is approaching these negotiations. Talk a little bit about the pressures they might be under, timeline pressures, and also, to the extent you're willing to talk about the competence of each side and how they're handling the negotiations so far. Sarah, I'm going to jump back to you first. You referenced the idea that the Iranian side is under some pressures. Recently, you wrote for us a piece, a blog for AGSIW on the the situation in Iran, and you talked about a perfect storm of pressures in that piece that Iran is under, external and internal. Could you elaborate a little bit on what pressures are shaping the Iranian approach to these negotiations?
I think the most obvious pressure is the economic pressure. Inflation is high, poverty is very widely expanding. Pensioners, working age Iranians, middle class, various across sectors, across different regional parts of the country, everybody is suffering from a huge amount of economic pressure. That, of course, puts them under puts the government under a lot of pressure, because if they do not manage to maintain an economic pressure, they have two options. One is to completely give in, and perhaps this is the route that, I don't know, we will have to wait and see, to give in to the US demands and successfully or not lift at least parts of the sanctions to get some air to breathe economically. The other path is to impose more violent crackdowns and more pressure and more surveillance and more oppression, which they are doing it anyways. But I believe that if the situation continues and the economic pressure continues, they might need to tap into that sort of mechanisms and tools a little bit heavier. How far can they go? It's beyond me to predict. But I think there are two major types of pressure. One is economic, and the other one is political. The political legitimacy of the government has been extremely undermined. We see that in the low participation in elections, for example. A lot of people who really praised, for example, Rouhani's election, supported Rouhani, before that supported Mousavi in 2009, even supported Ahmadinejad in his two rounds of elections and presidency, now are indicating a sense of political apathy and detachment because of lack of trust, lack of confidence in the political establishment. So these two are the most important issues. And I think with these negotiations, the government is hoping to get a little bit more room to maneuver in both respects. If they manage to deliver with a little bit of sanction relief, of course, that would have an obvious impact economically and socially. If they manage to deliver, also it's going to have political impact, because it shows that there is one administration, and that is administration of President Pezeshkian, who managed to finally, after 2 decades, as you mentioned, bring Iran out of this complete international deadlock.
Thank you, Sara. Ben, I'm interested in your assessment of how each side has played their hand so far. So the competence issue, but also if you could address the sense of a deadline, particularly on the U.S. side. Is there a sense of urgency to get a deal or to address this nuclear issue, and what is the source or sources of that urgency?
This is also an excellent question, because the nature of the sense of urgency is kaleidoscopic. It can be an external source based on the threat. For example, Iran right now is doing a very acute thing where, kind of like a funnel, double funnel, it is growing the nuclear program, diminishing the monitoring. This expedites the nature of the threat. This creates a sense of urgency. The second is, if you are looking at the sources of weakness, particularly the ones domestic and regional that Sara and Ali laid out. If you are keen to capitalize on that, as the Israelis are, well, then you have a narrow window of time before, at home, with respect to air defense, for example, the Islamic Republic builds back better or rehab some of its proxies in the region. So that, too, is a source of urgency. In my view, diplomatically, this is really the untold story here. 2025 is the year of decision on Iran, not because of America or Iran, but because of the Europeans, the last people who were really still in the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal. And really what we've seen traditionally since the nuclear crisis became a major issue, and since you had 4 or 5 major UN Security Council resolutions on Iran, is that every time America went to the left, the Europeans went to the right. Every time America went to the right, the Europeans went to the left. So much so that, for example, after UN Security Council Resolution 1929 in 2010, from that period and on, it was really a race between EU and US sanctions. And before the US got into the 2013 JPOA, there were more European designations against Iran than American designations. Fast forward, they took a drastically different approach under Trump. Trump went to the right, they went to the left, they opposed max pressure. Now they have this snapback option, which is a legal and political tool, which exists for them only up until October 2025. And in my view, this is the main forcing function making the Iran nuclear issue a crisis in 2025. Not that the Iranians and Americans can't ever hash it out again if they want to have private or public, direct or indirect bilateral diplomacy. That was always an option, that will always remain an option. Not that the Israelis or Americans don't have a military option, because that always was an option, that always will be an option. But the way to really bring partners on board to deal with this peacefully, that may expire, because if you have these sanctions elapse past October 2025, if you don't pull this snapback trigger, which takes a little over a month to pull, you will never have the Security Council as a place of consensus against the Iranian nuclear program again, given the warming Iran-Russia ties. In the past, the Russians would always sell the Iranians out at the right price. Now, I think even the most baseline dovish European assessment is you can never generate meaningful diplomatic pressure through the UNSC on the Iran nuclear issue ever again, so long as Russia plays this major kind of external security threat for Europe. And we have to take that seriously into account. And therein lies my fear, which is the Trump administration is not capitalizing on the major change of disposition in the E3. We've seen 14 or 15 rounds of EU and UK human rights and drone and military sanctions from 2022 to present by the Europeans. This is something that needs to be capitalized on the Americans. And President Trump can take the win on the cheap, basically by saying, Europe, when I left office, has been implementing max pressure without me. Now I'm back, let's do it together. The same, of course, is odd because the president is not taking the political win for the direct or indirect negotiations with the Iranians. Khamenei said no, 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 up until he had to say yes. This is a major political win. And I fear that the hyper beefed up sense of the crisis has actually put this president in this weird position where he's making and breaking history at the same time. You know, for example, one thing that he did between round, I think, 1 and 2 of nuclear talks is to sanction a Chinese refinery that is processing about $800 million of Iranian crude a year. The conventional wisdom, particularly Obama and Biden era wisdom, was that if you further nest the Iran issue into the China issue and you go after the major artery, which is oil, well, then not only will you spook negotiations, the Iranians won't come to the table, you'll create a much larger kind of contagion problem. That didn't happen. But at the same time, President Trump's, I would say respectfully, over-eagerness for a deal, marrying his return of the economic pressure policy with consistent rhetoric about seeking a deal and injecting positive optimism into the atmosphere around talks, creates the situation where if your main tool to squeeze the regime to get a concession is economic, well, then one need only look at the value of the real relative to the dollar since Nowruz, March of this year, up until present, where you've had 3 rounds of Iran nuclear negotiations. At the end of every single round, there's a promise of more. So there's a promise of another round first weekend in May, I think, back in Europe. And the real has actually appreciated, not appreciated relative to the US dollar, roughly by 20%, dropping from about 1 million to about 800,000, depending on the day and depending on the source. This ironically hurts his policy of using economic sanctions to kind of choke off the regime. So making and breaking history, you know, expediting and delaying the crisis at the same time, which makes this, again, a very kaleidoscopic problem and one that you can choose to hyper-focus on and say this has to be done because of the changing Iranian threat or the limited legal availability or the diplomatic option, or allow you to push away from the problem. You know, if I had 5 seconds with the president, I would say push away from the table, sir. You know, the whole art of the deal here is making them sweat. But you're not making them sweat. You're making them realize that you want this more than they do. I think there's a fundamentally different calculus in Tehran today, and I'll end with this, which is that they may not be interested in a deal given the drama of how the president left the deal last time, given the limited sanctions relief they got 2015 to 2017. And instead, I think they're engaging for 3 reasons. 1, to use negotiations as a human shield. So long as Trump is talking, Bibi is not shooting. That is, don't have to take that from me, even a former Israeli national security advisor believes Israel will not fire while there are direct negotiations going on. The second is that this limited economic relief. These are the things the Islamic Republic wants. The Islamic Republic is not trying to audition to become Sweden or Switzerland tomorrow. It is trying to get just enough relief to kind of limp along and have that narrative be there, which is we outlasted Trump, max pressure 2.0. And then, number three is also a narrative, which is if there is a deal, which is to say that we forced the same person who left the deal back in 2018 into a similar deal that he had critiqued starting in 2015. And that would be, political and strategic malpractice in my view, but that is part of the push and pull dynamics of what is making this at once very urgent and at once able to be kind of pushed away from.
Thank you, Behnam. We'll come back to some of these points that you've raised. Ali, there have been some limited hints on the Iranian side that they feel they're in a strong position. Even expressions of confidence that they may have outmaneuvered or that they are outmaneuvering the American side. In a recent Iran media review piece you quoted one Iranian official saying, quote, compared to previous dialogues, we find ourselves in a more advantageous position. Give me your sense, is this just bravado for domestic consumption, or do the Iranians really feel this way? Give me your sense about the competence, so to speak, of on each side of the negotiations.
The truth is that President Trump is not a normal political leader. President Trump is a revolutionary leader. And as a revolutionary leader who wants to transform the United States of America and transform the political order in the United States, President Trump values loyalty more than expertise. This is something that we also see and witness in the composition of the U.S. negotiation. It is even true of the head of the technical team of negotiators engaging in the talks with the Islamic Republic. These individuals are not necessarily nuclear experts, nuclear scientists. They are not necessarily economists, sanction experts, or lawyers specializing in international public law. These individuals have a very strong personal relationship with the president. Now, this discussion is perfectly well known for a certain generation of Iranians, because also in Iran after the revolution, we knew that there was a debate between takhassus wa ta'ahud, meaning expertise or loyalty. This is the same discussion that we are having here in the United States. It doesn't surprise me because President Trump is a revolutionary leader. He is not the type of leader that the United States has had before. Therefore, we need to expect these kind of things from him. And the second point, which also will be an answer to my good friend Behnam. What good did it do to anything to try to involve all these other countries in the talks between Iran and the United States? If the past experience was that many of these countries were actually trying to sabotage the talks, why on earth should President Trump invite people into the talks, every one of whom will try to advance his or her own agenda? So now we have discussions and negotiations between two parties, but at the same time, both parties are mature enough to brief their colleagues in the Persian Gulf region, in Israel. Iran is doing the same thing with the Russians and the Chinese, and also to some extent the Europeans. They are not directly involved because of the risk of sabotage, and each country trying to promote his or her own interest, but they are briefed, which is a good thing, and that is the way to do things. I believe that this approach has a much better chance of reaching a result. And I believe even a flawed agreement between the United States and Iran is better than the alternative, because I know what the alternative is. What?
Okay, thank you, Ali. Let's move into a consideration of some of the motivations of the players and also their leverage as they go into these negotiations and continue them. Sara, can you give us your sense about what is it that motivates the Iranian side? We talked a little bit about it, but if you could expand on it, what do you think their key objectives are in pursuing an agreement like this? And if you want to expand a bit on their the leverage they might have in obtaining it.
Yes, I think number one priority for Iranian government is to maintain power. They are facing various layers of threat, internally and externally, and they want to handle that threat and sort of weather their storm to come out of this crisis. The leverage that they have is, of course, they have used various tactics. They have used the old salami tactic that the Russians are also using to divide Europe and America. As a person who lives in Europe, I really fear about this divide at various fronts and in various contexts, and of course in the Iranian context. I don't think any good comes out of us not remaining united, because they are uniting full-heartedly. Them being, the Eastern Bloc, so to speak, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. They also have very openly talked about, for example, withdrawing from the NPT, from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They are very open about it. The first time they flirted with this idea was in 2019. Now they are very open and very on the record about it, and basically the 30 days threshold that Behnam mentioned for the E3 to inform and submit snapback requests to the UN Security Council, Iranians have openly threatened that on the very same day we are going to also pull out of the NPT and see what you can achieve from that. There is also another layer of leverage, and that is to keep the relationship with Russia and China relatively strong, or at least on the surface strong, to show that Iran has its own allies and its own strategic partners. Iran and Russia signed a strategic partnership a few years back. As we speak, the port of Bandar Abbas is burning in Iran, and the only country that was called in to help to put out the fire is Russia. The Russian airplanes are actively in the crisis zone and trying to help the government. So I think Iran is trying to play all of its cards in a very smart way. Of course, the tension between Iran and the GCC has been significantly and very well managed. The very same countries that back in 2015, 2016, in these conversations, these panels would have said, well, who is the United States to decide for us? If the Bushehr nuclear reactor explodes tomorrow, we are the one who is going to have to deal with the contaminated water that, south of the Gulf. But we never got a say into any of these decisions, and we never was involved, and we never, we only were informed when everything was reached. But today we're talking about a context and environment in which Saudi Arabia offers to host and mediate between Iran and the United States. So it's a completely different dynamic. Iran has used its power, its leverage to shift this dynamic, to shake these structures. In JCPOA negotiations, Zarif and his team were very clear that they said, we have one mandate, and that is to solve the nuclear crisis. We're going to ring fence this issue outside of anything else. Missiles, human rights, regional activities, out of question. We're not going to discuss any of this. Maybe in this time around, because of the US leverage through Israel, through post-2023 environment, that has changed, because President Trump has frequently mentioned that these are also concerns that we want to talk about. So I think both sides are really trying to utilize their leverage, but who is in the end going to come out with maximum gain from this, it's really a matter of time that we have to wait and see.
Thank you, Sara. Ali, also similar question. Assess the leverage that the Iranians have deployed, how successfully they're deploying it, and also talk a little bit about the divisions on the Iranian side, the different camps, and how are they affecting the negotiations?
Thank you. This is a very important question. The biggest fight within the regime, I would say, for the past couple of decades, has been one between the Revolutionary Guard on one hand and civilian politicians and the Ministry of Intelligence on the other hand. The Revolutionary Guard is obviously the most important military organization in Iran. But should Iran become a nuclear power, the Revolutionary Guard will become the custodian of Iran's nuclear bomb, just like the Pakistani military is the custodian of the bomb. Now, this is very important because no civilian politician in Pakistan ever benefited from Pakistan becoming a nuclear power. But the Pakistani military, as custodian of the bomb, has become one of the most important military organizations in the region. Very important, very, very important. The IRGC is aware of this. So what are they saying? They say, if we are to agree with a JCPOA-like agreement, which freezes Iran's nuclear program and postpones nuclearization, weaponization of Iran, let's say 10, 15, 20 years, we need something in return. And that something in return during the negotiation of JCPOA was foreign direct investment in Iran and possibly joint venture with IRGC-owned companies, because the Revolutionary Guard is not just a military organization, it's also one of the most important economic actor in Iran's economy. I suspect that the Revolutionary Guard is demanding something similar during this round of negotiations. And I suspect that the Iranian side has accepted their demand, which is why the IRGC is not vetoing the negotiations. So they say there must be something in it for us. And this something is removal of the Revolutionary Guard from the list of foreign terrorist organizations in the United States. That is one of the conditions, as I see it, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult for foreign businesses, U.S. businesses, but also non-business because of the non-U.S. secondary sanctions. It's very difficult for them to do any kind of business with Iran. IRGC businesses everywhere. That is one camp. The second, and by the way, the Revolutionary Guard approach to negotiations is also slightly different than the civilian one, because they believe that it would actually benefit Iran to behave a little bit more rough, just to show that Iran can play the disruptor in the region. For example, in order for Iranian nuclear negotiators not to enter the negotiation room empty-handed, what did they do? They activated the Yemeni Ansar Allah, the Houthis, back in January, targeting US ships. Before that, they were using, the Houthis, the Ansar Allah, to target civilian shipping. By January, they shifted. Why did they shift? Because they knew that the talks were coming. And the IRGC's approach is that we do not want our negotiators to enter the negotiation room empty-handed. They need to have something, bargaining chips, that they can use at the table. This is the analysis in IRGC. The civilian analysis is slightly different. They agree with most of the things that the IRGC says, also about the removal of the IRGC from the foreign terrorist organization list. But what they say is, by improving our relations with Saudi Arabia, by improving in relations with UAE, by deepening Iran's contacts in Iraq, we can actually compensate for losses in Syria and in Lebanon. That's a different approach. That's a very different approach. They believe that they can have Saudi and Emirati diplomats negotiate on Iran's behalf in Washington to lobby for Iran. That is what they're thinking. And let me also give those good people one idea, because in my opinion, it's not enough only to reach out to Arab states. The Islamic Republic of Iran, both the civilian leadership and the Revolutionary Guard, also need to reach out to Israel. They need to reach out to Israel. I'm not entirely sure that Israel right now is receptive for any outreach from Iran, because they may not believe it is in their interest. But it is in the interest of both civilian leaders and the Revolutionary Guard to establish line of communication with Israel, also with the Israeli military. This existed in the past. In the 1980s, Israel was the largest source of Iran's access to US-made arms. This was something that came out of the Iran contract. But even as late as during the presidency of Mr. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, of all the people, Mr. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, one of his vice presidents, Mr. Esfandiar Rahim Mashai, was out uttering a key sentence, and that was a signal to Israel. He said, the people of Iran and the people of Israel are friends. Listen, that was a key sentence. That was a demand from the US government. The US government told the Ahmadinejad government that if you want to engage in serious negotiations with us, you need to have somebody in the system saying this coded message. So we know that you actually are in control in Tehran. So one of the vice presidents said this, and there was no consequence. Iran needs to send these kind of messages. Reaching out to America is good. Reaching out to Arab states is good. But Iran also needs to reach out to Israel.
Thank you, Ali. Behnam, let's wrap up this focus on motivations and leverage. If you would cover the American side, what do you think they're trying to get President Trump in particular, either personally or strategically out of these negotiations? And on the leverage side, what kind of pressure tactics does the U.S. have, and have they been effective, whether it's increased in sanctions enforcement or military threat? What are they doing on leverage to keep the Iranians under pressure?
So if I may, just a footnote,
Please.
Respectfully disagreeing with my friend and colleague Ali, I think it's actually a sign of a strategic deficit if your adversary in a region is able to enlist your allies in a region into a diplomatic rope-a-dope policy against you. Call me crazy, but if Iran is able to enlist American allies into relieving or moderating pressure on the Islamic Republic, that is more of a problem than a solution. And I think with respect to Mr. Mashai, he got hit with all the Jariyana and Harafi, the deviant current stuff, the allegations about him and witchcraft and Ahmadinejad. So I mean, he did get his own because he also played with fire and the drama with Moslehi and the Ahmadinejad moving the Iranian intelligence minister. So it's not like things were cost-free. I do think the Islamic Republic does have, unfortunately, a better hand in the region because it has a regional policy. I would say for quite a while now, the U.S. doesn't have a regional policy. There is no Iraq policy. There's no Yemen policy. Go ahead.
So, I completely agree. Nothing is cost-free. What I'm saying is the alternative, war, is worse than a flawed deal. And that is something that the Arab states are also watching. It's not that they were somehow manipulated by Iran. They watch and
I think they were
well, that is, this is the solution. And then
wrap up and then we go back.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, and so I don't believe that the Arab states are manipulable by Iran. No, they are looking at their own national interests, and they see that even, and this is the argument they're making in public, even a flawed agreement postponing the crisis over Iran's nuclear program is better than war, which is the alternative.
We'll explore a little bit the calculations of the Gulf Arab states in a minute, but Behnam, please continue.
Yeah, this is so in terms of what the Islamic Republic has been able to do in the region, I call the model a knife and a handshake. 10 years of the Houthis and then handshake with diplomatic normalization. Because again, back to that Rouhani quote, the goal is to get America's adversaries in the region, not to be America's allies in the region, not to become an Islamic Republic 2.0 overnight. That's not the export of the revolution model we're talking about here. What we're talking about is a very strategic approach by the Islamic Republic, very much like what Ali was saying about the IRGC looking for leverage. Iran always engages in cross-domain escalation. Cross-domain escalation is quite literally the name of the game. So here, when it comes to trying to flip the Saudis or take advantage of the more mercantilist approach of the Chinese or anyone else who has interest in the region, this is the approach the Islamic Republic has long taken, which is to identify interests that you have, be able to threaten them for a long period of time at low cost, and then be able to remove that. So I think rightly here, the Islamic Republic understands that 4 American presidents since Bush to have been elected on the promise of doing less in the region, not more, all want a drastically different footprint. By dangling the sword of Damocles of a larger regional conflict, even though they're largely responsible for one triggered on the back end of October 7, they can actually get the US to hedge. They can actually get American partners to hedge and use the restraint, the caution, and the responsibility of other actors into a larger Iranian deterrent strategy. It is to play and pray upon those fears, that it induce restraint, that are designed to turn a blind eye to the other things that the Islamic Republic is doing in the region. Because Saudi, UAE, Emirati, GCC, whatever issues with the Islamic Republic didn't begin with a nuclear program, and I suspect won't end with a nuclear program. So that's just with respect to cautionary notes. On just the leverage really quickly, the leverage is primarily economic, but I would say if you're looking at what Trump is doing with the Islamic Republic in term 2, it is quite literally all options on the table, from good to bad and bad to good. It just depends on where you sit. Because one very sharp difference from Trump 2.0 to Trump 1.0 is the lack of a desire to invest significant political capital, at least now, into the outcome of what will happen with Iran. It was a very different approach than Trump 1.0, which made the Iran issue such a big domestic political priority. And so in that end, there is negotiations. So in that end, there is the return of max pressure. So in that end, there is a significant bringing of U.S. military assets into the region. So in that end, there is preemptive military action against the Houthis. So in that end, there is a significantly freer hand for Israel in Gaza and in Lebanon. All of this is the president investing quite literally in every single option and seeing which one provokes a reaction. Because once you're responding to someone, you are not driving the crisis, you're responding to something that they put out. And I think the Islamic Republic found an opportunity to throw up the hand here because they never actually got to diplomatically engage with the Trump administration in term 1. And this is their low-cost, least path of resistance to try to prevent a preemptive Israeli strike, to try to marginally improve the economy on the fringes, and to be able to blunt Trump's signature policy and main source of leverage, which is maximum pressure. So in this world, the U.S. does have leverage, unlike maximum pressure 1.0, which legally and politically was brought back May to November of 2018, but practically and macroeconomically really only impacted Iran from May 2019 to January 2021, and then in that limited time had more macroeconomic impact than a decade plus of multilateral sanctions. Trump has significantly more time to run the clock here, which begs the question, if he has more time, why isn't he? And that's because he's responding to Iran's leverage, which is growth of capability, diminishment of monitoring. And with the decline of some of Iran's transnational terrorist apparatus in Gaza and in Lebanon, with the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, with the domestic crisis at home, with the major interceptions of most of the Islamic Republic's ballistic missiles in April and in October, Iran is playing a high-risk, high-reward game right now by putting all the eggs in the nuclear basket and tying everything to the success of these negotiations. And I think the Trump administration, unlike other more hawkish Republican administrations, can kind of Teflon don this in the short time and not pay a domestic political cost. The question is, to your first question all the way to Ali about that 2-month deadline, what will happen when that 2-month deadline ends? Will there be what has been reported in some diaspora Persian press, which is the Iranians are trying to get the US into an interim deal, and that freezes or arrests the growth of maximum pressure? And what bearing will that have on our transatlantic partners? Will the E3 snap back without the US? Can you have an E3 policy to the right of Donald Trump when Donald Trump is doing a deal with the Islamic Republic? I think the Islamic Republic knows those main vectors of leverage against it, be it military deterrence, be it economic sanctions, and isn't offsetting it, but is putting a stick in that wheel. And I think they just realized that rather than fight it like they did May 2019 to January 2021, they might be able to, on the cheap, delay it. And that's what I think explains their approach to the major American sources of leverage.
Good, thank you. That a good exploration of the leverage and the motivations from each side. I think a clearer sense of that. Let's talk a little bit about the specific issues that they're going to negotiate. There are a range of issues. These are perennials. I mean, scope of sanctions relief, possible restrictions on Iran's missile program and support for regional proxies. This is an issue that Iran insists should not be a part of the negotiations, but the American side is as in the past, pushing for it. One of the most important issues is going to be enrichment of uranium and what level will be agreed to. Ali, let me start with you on that issue. How important is the principle of maintaining uranium enrichment capability? How important is that for the Iranian side, as you assess it?
I believe they believe it is existential, because that is the only difference between them and Gaddafi's regime. one of the models that I see the Israeli party is extremely interested in implementing is the so-called Libyan model. Libyan model means that Iran dismantles the entire nuclear infrastructure and ships it off to the United States. Such an option is not acceptable for the Islamic Republic because of the simple reason that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei saw exactly what happened to Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, chased by the mobs, killed. That is not going to happen with the Islamic Republic. They will insist on a domestic enrichment capability, which can guarantee against, and at least, theoretically provide the regime the opportunity to opt for weaponization if the United States removes itself or withdraws from another nuclear agreement with Iran. So that's really critical. The other thing which is also critical, I believe, is the missile program for Iran. Although there can be some agreements, and that was also the case, by the way, under the JCPOA with regards to the payload and range and also the type of missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. So those things may be involved in some kind of a discussion. And another thing which I honestly think Iran would be much more open to is actually discussing the proxies. Because when it comes to proxies, Iran today is not where it was during the JCPOA negotiations. Lebanon has been a disaster, a complete debacle. It is an intelligence victory for all ages, for Israel, what has happened to Lebanese Hezbollah. So why would Iran not try to negotiate, let's say, future of Hezbollah as a political party rather than a political party with an armed wing? So the armed wing, especially if the current situation in Syria does not allow Iran to export arms and to rearm Lebanese Hezbollah, Iran would be open to discussing the future of Lebanese Hezbollah. And that's a huge shift since we were discussing JCPOA. That's a huge shift. Another shift is obviously the future of Syria, where Iran does not appear to have any future. The small footprint that Iran is trying to gain is extremely problematic in the Kurdish areas of Syria. Very, very limited successes that Iran has had. So enrichment capability, Iran will not discuss it. Missile, qualified perhaps some small parts of it. But when it comes to the proxies, this time around, I think Iran will have a different approach.
Sara, I'm going to ask you about another issue that's going to come up, and you're free, of course, both of you will be free to respond to any of the issues that you think are critical or disagree with the views of others on the panel about these issues. The issue of sanctions relief. Why is this such a big issue for the Iranians? Obviously, they're not happy with the at least they say, and it's been very clear they weren't happy with the relief they got under the JCPOA. Talk to us a little bit about sanctions relief and how they're likely to approach it.
Why was it not successful under JCPOA? I think it's because there were various layers of sanctions on Iran, and especially to do with the U.S. transactions. And I remember for a very long time after JCPOA was signed, I was based in London at the time, we had various meetings with various academics and policy analysts around the world. And the Iranian view always was that the Europeans left us in the cold because they promised that they're going to find ways around this. But now we end up in a situation in which there is very limited impact of sanction release because, for example, the only bank at the time in London that was willing to open a bank account for Iran's national oil company in the city of London was NatWest because they had limited operations in the US and they didn't really have concerns about secondary sanctions. So then they came, the name unfortunately is escaping me. If you remember, please remind me, or the colleagues, the Europeans proposed a mechanism that
something.
Yes, insect, thank you very much, yes. To allow some form of sanction release, but then that also didn't get them anywhere. And that really caused a lot of rift between Iranians and the Europeans, because Rouhani administration was really hoping to get much more sanctions relief, much more business from the Europeans than they actually ended up doing. I remember a colleague from Oman once in a closed door session said that we are the ones who helped Iran during the tough times prior to JCPOA. We helped them. Nobody opened the letter of credit for them, but we did it. But when Rouhani wanted to make his first official visit, he didn't come to Muscat. He went to Rome, right? And he went to Rome.
Oh, first in the GCC.
Yes, yeah. No, not in GCC. I mean, his first official trip was to Europe, not to the GCC. So they were hoping, Tehran was hoping to get a lot more from sanctions release from JCPOA and that case. And they obviously learned from that lesson, and they wanted to make sure that they cover all the bases this time around, if there is a deal to be reached. Now, why is it important for them? It's just simple, the structure of the Iranian economy. Everything relies on oil. And so long as the government is able to pump out oil and sell it in the market and convert those US dollars, those petrodollars, or whatever currency that they manage, those foreign currencies, to convert it to real and spend it domestically, then they could claim some level of victory through diplomatic initiatives of engagement through sanction release that lead to sanction release. Who is ultimately going to be winner of this sanctions release? Obviously, number one is the political elite, is the IRGC, is those business people with guns, that they have access to resources, that they already have established business empires. There is also a smaller sort of elite that is going to suffer from a sanctions release, because they are really gaining a lot through sanctions release, through these bypassing mechanisms, through these front companies, through these shady operations, ghost fleets, and so on and so forth. So it is the reason that sanctions release is very crucial is that A, they learn from the lessons, and B, the government revenue, which is the government is the biggest employer in the country. The government runs the most of the profitable economic activities in the country, and the government relies on exporting hydrocarbon resources. And with sanctions, those are extremely costly, extremely difficult to maintain.
Thank you, Sara. Behnam, I'd be interested in your view on the enrichment capability issue. Are there divisions on the Trump side about the correct approach to this? Ali also mentioned the dismantlement issue. Are there divisions there as well, or is this just rhetorical divisions? And then one final aspect, if I could raise, we have from the audience a question about the missiles capability. Do you think that will somehow be included in the negotiations, and should it be in your?
Sure, thank you so much. I don't want to hold you guys way past 11, but there's a lot there. And so much was said. I promise, by the way, Ali and I are friends. I've learned so much from this man. But I'm going to disagree respectfully with part of what he said. But to the heart of your question, Mr. Ambassador, there's one big change everyone should know, which is in 2015, if you were a deal defender and a sanctions skeptic, you were for keeping it to the nuclear issue, particularly if you lived and worked in Washington. Conversely, if you were
the same in Europe, by the way.
And then now it's the opposite. If you are a deal defender and a sanction skeptic, you're for regionalizing it. Conversely, in 2015, if you were a deal detractor and sanction supporter, you were for widening it. And then all the way to 2025, if you are a deal detractor, sanction supporter, you're for narrowing it. Why? Like Ali mentioned Hezbollah, for example. Let's just prey on that example. By my estimation, it's too little too late to have the Islamic Republic foster political change 4 decades in after its most successful export of the revolution is Lebanese Hezbollah. Too little too late. There was a time to diplomatically disarm some of these folks. Too little too late. The Israelis have pulled the trigger. Now this is finally a military solution to a military problem. Same with Hamas. Same after the collapse of the Assad regime in Gaza, the Assad regime in Syria. It doesn't mean that the Trump administration doesn't need a political strategy. It desperately does need a political strategy in a place like Yemen, for example. But there is a military problem being dealt with a military solution. And at this point in time, to complicate nuclear talks, which are even more complex in 2025 than when they were in 2013 to 2015, or the first round in Oman privately in 2012. You would allow the Islamic Republic to trade and actually bail out its waning assets that would otherwise have to be subject to military force. So in our estimation, that's not a good trade. That's why in 2025, given the growth of the nuclear threat, the employment of other tools to deal with some of the regional threat, it is better to keep it separate. Now, FDD actually had a monograph on this. We conceived of between the Trump election in November and inauguration in January, a different discourse because of this whole deal or no deal paradigm. And that was to move the conversation away from arms control towards dismantlement. Dismantlement is a word from the chemical weapons lexicon. Technically, it should be disarmament, but the Islamic Republic doesn't have nuclear weapons. So you're dismantling infrastructure. You're not disarming a weapon that is not armed. And yes, this is exceptionally high risk, high reward. Libya Gaddafi is one of the examples, and even Khamenei himself has critiqued that example. I think he said that Gaddafi traded away like a piece of candy, I think is the word, or a piece of chocolate. Khamenei critiqued. But there's examples. Ukraine is also not the best example, but it is one. Taiwan is a much better example. South Africa is the best example. And if you care about the Iranian people, that comes with a free regime change example, by the way. I personally don't believe the US should be in the business of making sure the Islamic Republic of Iran sticks around for another 4 decades. You can debate that proposition if you want to, but that is something that the US government should not be in the business of having to be forced to ensure, nor is it fair to say that ensuring regime survival from domestic pressure was something that the Libya 2003 chemical weapons deal was all about. And there's a certain diplomatic history in the run-up to 2003, particularly in October, when the Libyans are caught importing material, I think in October, that led to the agreement initially in December of that year. So that is that package. With respect to missiles, I actually think that you should treat them as a WMD delivery vehicle, if particularly for 2 decades, the US intelligence has been saying this is the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. For a little under a decade, they've been saying Iran's ballistic missiles are inherently capable of delivering WMD. And a little bit less, they've been saying that if Iran was going to develop a nuclear weapon, it would choose a ballistic missile as the means of delivering it. So even if you're going to push away from our idea of dismantlement or disarmament and adapt a smaller arms control-based approach, you would be doing yourself a disservice if you did not regulate or control the arm that you believe they would potentially be able to use. So I believe that this stuff, missiles plus enrichment, as Ali said, is borderline existential for the regime. And that's why this entire conflict between Tehran and Washington is actually not about enrichment capacity or the number of centrifuges. It is about cost measured in money and time that you can also measure in political capital. Who will invest more cost? And God forbid that cost moves to blood, not just treasure. And who will invest more time, political capital, into forcing their paradigm onto the other. One reason why we can't judge anything yet, based on what the Trump administration has been saying, is about negotiations, they haven't been saying much. Ali and I were just talking, the Iranian negotiating team has been much more disciplined, having much more consistency, having much better before and after nuclear talks media narrative framing, whereas the Trump administration, before talks, they'll talk about permitting enrichment, then after talks, they'll talk about dismantlement, yet talks move from political to technical. There is a much more incongruent political approach that, if you're an administration supporter, you're calling this 4D chess. If you're an administration detractor, you're calling it amateur hour. Probably the truth is somewhere in between. Occam's razor in DC, who knows? But the absence of a clear and guiding framework from the Trump administration on enrichment will continue to be a problem. And it would mean that if talks progress in the absence of this framework, arms control versus dismantlement, and there is progress in the talks, that would mean that the US is more likely than not conceding something in those talks to have them continue, which raises the question of traditional Republican detractors of diplomacy with Iran having their voices more manifest as they are today.
Thank you, Behnam. I'm going to move on to sort of the diplomatic context of these negotiations. We've got a couple of questions from the audience that focus on specific diplomatic players. But let me sort of kick it off by asking you, Sara, about Russia and about its influence. I think you mentioned it a little bit earlier. What is the Putin factor in all of this? Is Russia having an influence in the way that Iran is approaching these negotiations? How important is Russia's support?
I would say that Russia's support, Russia-Iran relations look from outside a lot stronger than they actually are, in my opinion. For example, economically, since the war in Ukraine, they started really engaging in high-profile agreements and memorandums of understanding and signing this and that and PR moments and photo ops and so on. But when you look at the tangible, really trade level, for example, I looked at the data for a piece that we published end of last year. There isn't really much. There's pistachios and dried fruits and so on going from Tehran, which wasn't sanctioned anyways because these are food items. Those are strategic alliances that economically help Russia, and Russia wants, especially the Europeans, to perceive Iran-Russia's relations really isn't that strong. Of course, there is a military aspect, missile drone trade, which according to Mr. Zarif, it's a purely commercial dealing between Tehran and Moscow. There is absolutely no other interest. But I would say that politically, Russia has been a neighbor that relations with Russia have been always handled at the senior leadership level, i.e. the supreme leader or the office of supreme leader. Whereas many other diplomatic relations are usually traditionally handled through the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but Russia is always the case that is really handled at a very senior level. And of course, that gives Russia a lot of privileges in terms of trying to pursue its own strategic vision for the region through Tehran. I don't believe ultimately Russia wants a nuclear Iran. Because no good comes out of that to have a nuclear neighbor. But at the same time, Russia really, the same way as China, they really enjoy to poke the US in the eye through Iran. Should it be through nuclear sabotaging or influencing a possible nuclear deal, or through the escalation of the nuclear program, or through bypassing sanctions. So Iran is a useful tool to annoy the United States. And if I was sitting in Moscow, I wouldn't really want to give up that tool because it's working really perfectly well. There is also a camp of Iran analysts that believe that the influence of Russia in Iran domestic politics has increased. For example, a former Iranian ambassador to Moscow now is a VP in Tehran. So that is, by some analysts, taken as a sign that Moscow has increased its influence into day-to-day running affairs of Tehran. I don't think it's that simplistic, it's that black and white, but obviously Tehran has a lot more affiliation, and perhaps even one could label it as loyalty, maybe, or trust is a better word for Moscow than it has for any other Europeans and Western capitals, for that matter. And even though Russia is not a party to these negotiations, but the first round of meetings in Moscow, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Rytkov came with a private jet directly from Moscow to Muscat. So Moscow is being very much consulted at senior level. They are being engaged indirectly, perhaps, in these negotiations. Ultimately, if there is a dismantlement or disarmament or whatever it is called of the nuclear program, Russia is the one that has to be very much involved, because they always, even at least according to the JCPOA, they were the country that were helping with disposing, enriched uranium and so on and so forth. So I think Russia will maintain that position, will continue using Iran to annoy the West. And if I may, it's a very bold comment, but I genuinely believe that they will even use Iran to win some brownie points in negotiations over Ukraine, as and when opportunity arises. In which way is not exactly clear to me, but again, it only makes sense if they have this leverage to try to use it in other negotiations with the United States.
Thank you, Sarah. Ali, can you talk a little bit about we mentioned it in passing, but just maybe drill down a little bit on the Gulf Arab states and how their calculations have changed so dramatically, and their diplomacy on the Iran issue has changed so dramatically since the 2014 to 17 period.
Just a single word about Iran-Russia relations. It's a love-hate relationship, totally devoid of love. And by the way, it's distrust, mutual distrust. Russia has always sold out Iran and Iranian interests. Every single time. Iran truly wanted to perceive Russia as a strategic ally. Russia, on the other hand, has always systematically perceived Iran as, at best, a tactical ally, and most of the time, a useful pawn, an expendable pawn in the grander chess game with the United States. That is the Russian approach towards the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran knows it. Revolutionary Guard knows it. The civilian leaders know it. And this is why they're making a shift to the United States, because they know they cannot rely on Russia. They are also expecting Russia to sabotage these talks, just as Israel is trying to help the progress of negotiations by suggesting a Libya model for Iran. The Russians are telling Iran, do not give any concessions. We will be supporting you at the United Nations Security Council. Of course they will not. As soon as they have an opportunity for it, they will betray Iran, as they have done in the past. Now, when it comes to the Gulf Arab states, that's a very different situation. Iranian leaders have, for the first time since the revolution, begun to look at Saudi Arabia as an independent actor. Before, even the Shah perceived Saudi Arabia as a Western pawn, as a stooge. This is how they look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia had no independent foreign policy. Saudi Arabia, according to Iranian thinking, had no independent acting in the region. It was just an agent of the United States. Everything changed with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. They genuinely realized that here there is a leader who is a nationalist, who is independent, and who is not necessarily listening to Washington. They gained respect for him. They changed their behavior. They changed their thinking. They began to realize that United Arab Emirates has actually its own interests. As a small state which wants to play a strategic role in the region, they realized how complicated Iraq is. It's not just the Gulf Arabs, also Iraq. They found out finally how complicated a country Iraq is. Now, therefore, they have an approach to every single of these countries, trying to play on their fears, as Behnam correctly pointed out, because they believe that that is also a part of diplomacy. If there is no threat of military action and sabotage, they will not be talking to you. You also need to show some kind of force every once in a while. That's very unfortunate for our friends, but that is how they think. But at the same time, they genuinely believe that they are dealing with sovereign states and leaders who are independent. And that is the biggest shift in diplomacy of the Islamic Republic. And I believe this is largely due to the person of Crown Prince bin Salman. That I believe is the case.
Thank you, Ali. Behnam, I'd be interested in your view of the other critical player in the region and their calculations, Israel. Have their views on this issue changed since the JCPOA was negotiated, and what are their views now?
Well, Israel is also a kaleidoscopic society, but there's a pre-October 7 Israel and a post-October 7 Israel. And it's important to note that even you could be to Bibi's left on one issue, particularly as a border-related issue, be it Hamas or Hezbollah or future of Syria, or seeing Syria through the lens of now competition with Turkey, for example, and then still be hawkish on the Islamic Republic of Iran. I think that's an area of more consensus than dissonance today. I'm not an Israel domestic politics expert, but just how this Iran issue has continued to touch both Israeli policy and politics is very interesting. I think the Israelis have now tasted this theory, particularly after 2024, that can begin to change the options available to America, which is America's post 9/11 strategy, footprint, wars, what have you, in the Middle East was defined by the Islamic Republic being able to have a limited war option for itself while denying for everybody else a limited war option. I think the Israelis in 2024 began to open the door of what a limited war option looks like.
No, I agree.
Both with direct attacks on Iranian territory, to begin to socialize that a little bit and have that enter the conversation as an option. I don't know, again, we only know what was leaked or reported, that New York Times story from about a week or 2 weeks ago, where I think the verb they may have used was the president waved off strikes from the Israelis. I actually put a lot of attention onto the verbiage there. And I mean this with immense respect, but with looking through the lens of not just Israel-America relations, but Trump-Bibi relations, and also the US willingness to use force. Because in this case, it was supposed to be, at least if you believe that New York Times story, Israel and America, a joint operation. These guys have actually trained on this stuff before, even on the Biden administration. There was a very famous military exercise, Operation Juniper Oak, kind of signaled this stuff as well. Every time the US has B-52s in the region, that's politically cheap. But every time the US has B-2s, that sends a qualitatively different message to the Islamic Republic that there's a credible Israeli military option, a credible American military option, let alone one that could be paired with, I don't know, an advanced strike by Israel or who knows. But I think the Israelis have been trying to socialize the concept of a limited strike into US policy thinking. And that's where that potential attack in May would have come from. But I mentioned the verbiage of waved off here, because I think there may be, and I want to be careful with this word, a casualness with which the president may wave off strikes and also wave on strikes. If you believe the reporting from 2019 to 2020, allegedly in the spring, summer of 2019, President Trump did not want to go after Qasem Soleimani as a response to that multi-domain, cross-domain escalation that we saw in 2019, particularly in the oil front and particularly in the Iraq front. But then that decision changed after December 2019, January 2020. So I think the Israeli approach to the president, which is a little bit different if you look at the approach to traditional Republicans and some pro-Israel supporters in the States, who are trying to in some way bludgeon the president for what appears to be a mistake coming towards a JPOA or JCPOA type model. There is interestingly more political silence from the Israelis. Maybe there's a response to things that are leaked, but they're not driving the train like we saw back in March 2015 with a congressional heavy approach. Perhaps that will change if there is a deal, but I don't think there is that kind of congressional option available to the Israelis, because one big difference of Obama and Trump is that whether you believe Trump is a revolutionary leader or not, or whether you think that he's architecting a qualitatively different Republican working class, almost populist foreign policy, Trump is changing the brand of Republican foreign policy decision making by riding both the internationalist and the isolationist trains or buses or cars at the same time. And because of that, both wings of the Republican Party are politically more beholden to him today. And because of that, there is the concern that, this is a president who could take a limited Iran deal and make it a treaty. And that would have implications not just for the Republican Civil War, not just for non-proliferation experts, but for the future of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and as well as the personal and political future of the Trump-Bibi relationship. Whereas Trump may say or perceive, allegedly, I give you a free hand in Lebanon and Gaza, you give me a freer hand in Iran, or the Israelis may infer more linkage between Lebanon, Gaza, and Iran. It's too soon to tell. But I think thus far, the Israelis are playing it very differently from March 2015 compared to now, which is April 2025. That may change if there's more success or less success in the talks, but the degree to which there is linkage inferred, either by President Trump or by Prime Minister Netanyahu, that'll be something to watch, as well as the opportunities for the Israelis to continually socialize the thesis of limited military action. My personal fear is pushing away from the table, and my writings, views, statements on the need for max pressure to be married with something like maximum support, something internally in Iran, makes me very worried about two things. One, a limited deal, that buys time for the Islamic Republic, rehabs them, kicks the nuclear deal down, kicks the nuclear can down the road, gives them more opportunities to leverage weaponization down the road, or B, a limited strike. Because one thing I am concerned about is potentially locking in a Iraq 1991 type model, where the regime may not have enough capability to respond militarily to a foreign adversary, but after being neutered by a foreign adversary, lack of political attention being paid to the whole host of other threats and issues that we've long had with the Islamic Republic, terrorism, human rights, what have you, and then you lock in that Islamist tyranny at home, and all they have to do now is because they've lost face abroad, they come home and they crack skulls. And that could be a very dangerous scenario. And many people in this town forget about the differences between 1991 and 2003. Many people forget about the 1990s on Iraq, what happened in Iraq. And I would hate to see everyone who is so afraid of 2003 forget about how we got to it by ignoring the post-1991.
Thank you, Behnam. Those were a good concluding flourish there. I want to we've got just a couple of minutes. I want to give our other panelists a chance to wrap up. And I want to play off of Behnam's statements there at the end about what he fears the most. I wonder if each of you would say in a word what it is in these negotiations that you fear the most, what is the most possible negative outcome. And if you want to end on a positive note, you can sort of paint what you think is the most optimistic outcome. Not a lot of time, take a minute or so, each one of you, and you can answer that. Ali, you want to start?
Well, I do share some of the concerns that my good friend Behnam has. But my concern number one, it is that opponents of a nuclear deal between Iran and the United States will try to sabotage as much as possible with all sorts of activities, even false flag operations. This is something that I am fearing. And there are countries capable of doing such a thing, other countries which are critical of JCPOA and of the current nuclear negotiations, they do not have such options available to them. But even false flag operations, that is a very real risk, as I see it, for the ongoing negotiations. Second thing that I'm afraid of is somewhat the psychology of the ultimate decision maker in the United States of America. Yes, President Trump is a revolutionary leader. He has a revolutionary agenda. He is trying to change the political order in the United States of America. Very, very important. But he also has a tendency to agree with the last person advising on foreign policy issues. And that obviously is also highly problematic, because if he is going to change his opinion about these things rather fundamentally, that is perilous statecraft, as I see it. The third concern that I have is that some of the states capable of doing this sabotage will do it for a longer period of time. My good friend Behnam referred to Iraq in the 1990s. What was happening in Iraq in the 1990s? The US government was bombing random sites in Iraq, was trying to pay Iraqi officers to engage in a coup d'etat against Saddam Hussein's regime, hoping that the regime would collapse. Under the economic pressure, under pressure from armed opposition inside of Iraq, the ethnic minorities, and also because of a coup d'etat. Now, imagine Israel doing the same thing with Iran. Iran is not capable of defending its airspace. Israel could bomb random targets in Iran once a week, just to show that the regime is weak. Israel is also capable and has earlier in history shown that it is able of arming ethnic minorities against the central government in Iran. And if there is also no deal between the United States and Iran improving Iran's economy, Iran will be moving in the same direction that Saddam Hussein's Iraq was moving under the Clinton presidency. That is why the Iraqi state collapsed totally in 2003, because the gradual weakening of the Iraqi state began in the 1990s, not in 2003. So this is also something that I am extremely fearful about. And this is also why I'm not as optimistic as some members of the Iranian opposition saying that if there is regime collapse in Tehran, Iran is going to be a democracy tomorrow. No, I do not believe this. I want to agree with a flawed agreement between Iran and the United States, because even a flawed agreement is better than the alternative.
Thank you, Ali. Sarah?
Thank you. Ali sort of opened the door to what I was about to say, and I think that's a nice transition. So I respectfully, if I may, disagree with him. It's not black and white between two scenarios, war or deal. There is also a third scenario, which is a political transition. Who knows how bloody or how difficult or how tough it might be? Who knows whether it's wishful thinking of the opposition in diaspora? But what we know, especially since 2022, is that an increasing majority of Iranians have started to envision an Iran beyond the current political formatting. So whether it's a transformation from within, whether it's just cosmetic changes of IRGC commanders shaving their beards and putting suit and tie and going and shaking hands with Western politicians, or is it like a drastic change of hand?
And let it be bow tie, bow tie.
Perfect. I'll give that to you, Ali. Don't worry. So there is also another alternative, and that's what the maximum support element comes into picture. Unfortunately, in the short medium term, and I'm not saying unfortunately I have to agree with Ali, no, unfortunately for the people of Iran, but I have to agree with Ali that transition period is in either case going to be bumpy. If there is a deal, it's going to strengthen the current establishment, it's going to maintain the violations of human rights, it's going to maintain the nepotism and corruption, it's going to maintain the current system, all the purging and oppression and lack of freedom of speech and gender bias and all.
And why should that be a problem from a U.S. viewpoint? Why should the Trump administration care about these things that you care about? They don't.
We've got to wrap it up. But
that is.
I'm happy to do that on a separate panel.
But I would say that the United States should change that mentality. That might be the dominant mentality, but they need to be aware that if there is a liberal, democratic, normal state in Iran, a lot of other things, a lot of the deployments, a lot of the fighting with proxies, a lot of worrying about Israel, a lot of this, a lot of that is likely to be resolved. I'm not saying 100% because I don't know who is going to end up in control.
Thank you, Sarah. Behnam, I'll give you the short side of a minute to a concluding remark.
I would love to touch on what both have said, but that strikes me as an after-hour session. I would love to just pick on the fears and the opportunities. The fears, I've said them already. A limited deal empowers, entrenches the authoritarianism, heightens the non-nuclear threats that we face from this regime, basically allows them to reinvest. You've seen the movie before, 2015 to 2017, not on the population, but in the threat vectors that have now unfortunately only grown over time. The second one, I think a limited strike can get you into a cycle of violence that doesn't have a political end, and B, may forget about the real facts on the ground and the real forces of change, which is not a defection or whatever, but the continuously protesting Iranian populace, which the last thing you would want for those folks is to have to live in a post-91 Iraq scenario. I have differences about what you want in the region, strong state, weak state, about Saddam 91. We can flesh them out in after hours. Those are the negatives. The positives is the US still has a significant opportunity to push away from the table. The US still has a significant opportunity to push away from the table. If you want what I want, which is, first of all, I would say diplomacy in 2025 after the military defeats of 2024, own goal. But if you're going for diplomacy anyway, you need to aim high. You need to aim high because the Iranians historically, especially when they engage bilaterally, this was the Rouhani 2013 statement, let me go negotiate with the village chieftain, which is put the Europeans aside, put the Russians and Chinese aside, go straight for America. They're the ones with the sanctions. We have to unlock the relief this way. Every time the Iranians do that, they enter weak. They enter with a weak hand, but they leave with a strong hand. And that is really the fear of having these talks perpetuate. I talked about the appreciation of the dollar. If you're an illicit shipper right now, you're an illicit transport of Iranian oil to China. If you think a deal is coming and the president keeps giving you a signal that deals are coming, well, then why would you give up your role as a major shipper of oil or petrochemicals, which are significantly more expensive and has a significantly higher return on investment? So there still is an opportunity to change this dynamic. And that begins with pushing away from the table. If the president is keen to not have Iran cost him anything politically so much this year, coordinate more with the E3, do snapback, set a new least common denominator, multilateralize max pressure, push away from the table, increase the squeeze. As you increase the squeeze from the top, support the people from below, the available resources begin to shrink, and have the regime fight each other over, should we respond decisively and punch out of the box, in which case they're asking for it, or should we continue to absorb, in which case as they absorb, you continue to squeeze. And the theory of the case is make the regime make a mistake. No more own goals in 2025. Make the regime make a mistake.
Thank you, Behnam. I want to thank our distinguished panel, a great discussion. Thank our audience that was live here with us today. Thank you very much. On Zoom, we appreciate your attendance as well. I look forward to working with you and hosting other events as we go forward. So thank you all again, and we'll see you at our next event. Thank you.